the last session.
I think there's one after this.
Oh, is there one after
Yeah.
this? Well, too bad. So as Connor said, by the way, my name is Ankur Kadakia. I'm with Iconic Air. And I'll let Connor introduce himself when you're up. But effectively, it's all around the voluntary market. That kind of just fed into the title we wanted to run with today, which is, credits, debits, offsets, oh my, because there's just so much happening in the space, in the voluntary market, and even in the regulated market. So just kind of it's really a teaser, to be honest, today. It's kind of 30,000 foot. I wanted to come in, give folks an opportunity just to learn the language, learn what's happening in this space, start to put kind of like you said, a cost of carbon to your emissions in your portfolio. So I'll get this going. I should use this. As I mentioned, I'm from Iconic Air. We're a software startup that's really here to help companies digitize their carbon. And we help them through the journey for net zero, starting with automation around calculations, reporting, certification, and then really moving into helping companies in the journey of net zero. And then what we're going to talk about today is an area that we call internally, and a lot of other folks call it, it's around finance carbon, right? Or finance emissions, which is all around helping companies offset the emissions that they cannot reduce. And at the end of the day, a lot of these companies, especially if you're publicly traded, have made commitments in the next 5 to 10, 15 years to effectively be net zero or carbon neutral. And the reality is you can do so much in terms of reducing your own operational emission footprint. The rest of it, you're going to have to either offset by credits, et cetera. And so we'll talk really around this, and we want to help companies understand, what is it they need to offset or they need to net in terms of their emissions so that they can actually get to zero or carbon neutral. Right. Just a little bit about us, and just honestly, it's not really just about us. It's where this industry is headed. There's a lot of different companies out there that are helping with offsets, helping with offset projects, or they're capturing carbon credits and then selling that into a marketplace. And it's varied, and you'll hear a little bit around that. The range is very, very broad, and you certainly can go look for yourself and see some of that. One thing to just keep in mind, one thing that we're working on, and hopefully you guys are working on as well, is working through carbon offset registries. Did I say that right? Offset registries. Those that have some sort of criteria, whether it's from an environmental standpoint, social standpoint, combination of both, to accredit the offsets that are being generated by projects around the world. And so the idea is, how do you track that? It's a very financial element to carbon, if you will. So it's almost like tracking it in a ledger, right? You want to be able to know what's been verified, what do you have, when do you need to retire it, and then potentially what can you put back into the market because you have a surplus. So that's the whole concept here around finance emissions. And our software is really designed to help companies start tracking that, looking at different cost curves, looking at different projections, and then ultimately purchasing and putting carbon credits back or offsets back into the market. With that, I'll let Connor kick it off.
Thanks, Ankur. So yeah, for those, my name is Conor Merrigan. I run the sustainability program at Spirit Environmental, and we're going to jump a little bit into the deep end, and then sort of back off a bit and just sort of cover that terminology. But this particular concept, the costs of carbon, is something you're hearing a lot. I imagine it is it's a complicated. It's much more complicated than what is ultimately what we're advising clients to go with, which is this bottom one, this sort of shadow cost of carbon. It used to be called. Now we sort of have embraced the term of a carbon hurdle rate. But the cost of carbon means a lot of different things. And when you're figuring out what that cost of carbon means for your company, and you're having those discussions internally and externally, there's a number of factors that need to be pulled in to make that. And it's an area where nuance is important and also hard to communicate. And people, just because it's on the one hand, this special one, and the fact that it is ultimately, it is $1 per metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, right? So it's not just CO2, it's CO2 equivalent, but in general, it can be just CO2 in some cases. But That is a simple concept, right? How much does it cost to effectively reduce a metric ton of carbon dioxide and take it out of the atmosphere, prevent it from happening, what have you? But it's made up of all these different pieces. When I say the social cost of carbon, this is a federal number that was originally put in. Actually, I don't know. Was it? You may know. Was it pre-Obama that it got put in? It was pre-Obama, and then Obama kept it in and sort of reinforced it with able to use this number of what is the social cost of 1 ton of carbon on society as a whole, right? How much does that cost in terms of detrimental health impacts, primarily from estimates and models of climate change? So if you say, okay, you're going to have more wildfires, you're going to have more increased heat, and that's going to cause sickness for vulnerable populations. They did sort of a meta-analysis of what the cost of that would be to society. And there's also a very important subcomponent of that, which is the discount rate, which is effectively, and I'm not going to get into that other than to say the discount rate is a measurement of if you mitigate it now, then it's going to have greater, it's the degree to which if you mitigate a ton of carbon now, you believe that it will have long lasting effects, right? So if it is if the discount rate is really high, I want to make sure I'm saying this right, is really high, that means you think that, or no, if it's, this discount rate always messes with me, and I do this for a living, not as much, again, as our friend in the back, but if it's basically, if it's lower, I know the federal government has set the average of around 2.5% to 3% on their discount rate, which effectively means that the cost of a mitigated ton of carbon to society now is going to give you much greater benefits in the future. And if you set a discount rate that is, I believe it's lower, although I could be wrong, it's like 1% or whatnot, that means you don't think that the mitigation is going to have as much of an impact, right? You think you can punt it down the road, you'll be able to do it, then the price of carbon will not raise as steeply. So right now, the price of carbon, this social cost of carbon, was about $40 during the Obama era, and then it went down to like $2 or $3 when Trump was in office, and now it's back up, and it has this escalation rate. It's easier to think of it as an escalation rate than a discount rate. I just use that term, and it's going up about 3% a year, right? So $40 keep going up and up and up. They're actually still they're about to release what they think the revised social cost of carbon is. It was supposed to be earlier this year, hasn't come out yet. That number is going to be used internally, like in the federal government, for the GSA, making a lot of decisions for federal facilities and that kind of thing. They are legally required to incorporate this social cost of carbon. You are not, right? We are not required to incorporate that, but it is one of the many cost of carbon benchmarks that you should be thinking about when setting your internal social cost or your internal cost of carbon. So you have that, it's pretty high, right? The social cost of carbon, how much is going to impact as determined by the EPA. Then you have a carbon offset price. And then is further divided into sort of regulatory or voluntary. And I'll demonstrate the markets here in just a second. But the carbon offset you can get for, retail about 10 to $20 for a annual offset of a ton of carbon, right now. And that price goes up and down. It depends, and I'll get into some of the differences of different types of offsets. On the regulatory market, it's much higher. You're looking, and I'll show a couple slides there, but that's basically, okay, we've emitted the term I like is residual emissions. After we've done everything we can to reduce our emissions, our residual emissions are still, look at your EPA reporting, your 1.6 million metric tons or of carbon that you still have, that you reported to the EPA. Then it's going to, if they're $10 a piece, you can do the math on that to figure out what it would be to claim to be a net zero operator, right, on the scope 1. And so that's one way. So you get there with your offsets. There's regulatory, there's voluntary. Most of them are voluntary, but California, has a regulatory market. Obviously, Europe has a regulatory market. And then, okay, so that's the deep end quick. Let's simplify this a little bit. The implicit cost of carbon. This is a term that we've been using, our clients have been using, and it's how much does it cost when we do a, say, a pneumatic retrofit effort, right? How much does it cost? What's the total project cost? What's the total metric tons of carbon reduced on an annual basis from that? That's it. And so when what we're seeing more and more is ops people, corporate folks saying, what is the implicit, what are we currently paying across all of our emission reduction efforts? And some projects we're paying $7 per ton removal, some we're paying $40, some we're paying $120, and some of it's a side benefit, right? It's not, maybe you're doing a project for just efficiency and it happens to have some reduction, or you're trying to increase production, you're trying, whatever it is. If it has a carbon reduction element, you can do the numbers on it. If you know that a particular project that you're implementing is reducing a certain amount of carbon, and you know how much that project costs you as a company to implement, that's what we call the implicit cost of carbon, right? And that is related to this last one, which is the one that when you hear cost of carbon, what most companies are talking about, whether it's Exxon or whoever, they're talking about what we call the carbon hurdle rate, because that term tends to resonate, right? If a project costs less than our carbon hurdle rate, so again, on this same metric of dollars per metric tons of carbon reduced, then we do it, right? Then we don't need to go through all the sort of layers of approval that we would otherwise. If we have a carbon management program and we have a carbon emissions reductions team, you have that pneumatic retrofit project, somehow that comes in at $8 per metric ton of carbon reduced, that's a go ahead. So there are companies, oil and gas companies that we are working with, who are using that way and say, okay, go, just go. Don't wait. Don't collect $200. Don't just pass go and make it happen. And that's what we say this carbon hurdle rate is. And if it's above that, so you've heard Exxon, I think they came out with $40. Then they were going to, raise it up a little bit. Right now we see about $40 as the from some of the majors as the number that's generally floated out there as far as what is our cost of carbon. They just call it a cost of carbon because that's what people hear. What we call the carbon hurdle rate. And so if a project costs less than $40 per ton of carbon reduction, it's going to go ahead. And that's when you hear these public commitments that are frankly, if you're in my last session, are very dangerous to make. Publishing this cost of carbon is still something we recommend publishing a range and not saying what your exact number is, because it's going to fluctuate. As you think about the social cost of carbon, you think about the cost of offset, you think about all these things, it's really getting to that hurdle rate takes a good deal of financial analysis, takes a good deal of, and it's only one piece of the pie, right? Because if you have a project that you're doing for other reasons, the carbon reduction price is only one part of that decision-making process. Okay. So cost of carbon, I know it's a lot. Any basic questions on that though, before I move on?
Connor, I'm just going to jump in here. Right now, the focus is very much on leveraging this to net out your scope 1, scope 2 emissions.
Right.
But there are companies that have started to make scope 3 commitments, and you're seeing regulators look at scope 3 as well. And when you look at, the full emission profile for any oil and gas company, the scope 3 just dwarfs scope 1 and 2. So just kind of keep that in mind. Once that starts to kick in, those costs of carbon, the different ones, will take different shape and kind of escalate.
Right.
Yeah, quick question there.
Yeah, sure.
California, you mentioned, has the regulatory.
They do.
But those are primarily allowances, which I assume a company can't call themselves carbon neutral if they're offsetting their emissions with the balances, right?
No, they can just meet their threshold. That's like it's more sort of cap and trade, where they have a certain threshold. If they exceed it, they need to buy other offsets to get back under to their permit level. It's effectively that's
It's a permit level,
yeah,
right? But not.
Right, but they're not, if they wanted to go to zero, they would do the regulatory first and participate in that market. If they wanted to, they could buy those same credits they would just be paying a lot of money, a lot more money for them than they would be for voluntary credits.
Exactly.
Because they're more, but they could, yeah, they absolutely could. They could buy them from other emitters in California to get all the way down to zero, in theory. That would not be cheap.
No.
So, and really just to put a little bit of guide rails on this, for the bang for your buck, you're still going to be better doing the reduction projects and getting rid of your emission reduction project. Anything that falls under that carbon hurdle rate, do that. Not only does it reduce your absolute emissions and your greenhouse gas intensity, but you don't have to buy them year over year, right? If offsets, you buy them every year, right? You have to say, this is what our emissions were in 2021. We need to buy them and offset, and then 2022 happens, and you need to keep buying them over and over again. So that's a $20 a year per ton type of commitment, where if you can find a project where you can reduce your emissions straight away, that continues to have those paybacks, because in theory, things fluctuate, but it's going to keep providing you those reductions every year. And then finally, after you've done that, you get to your offsets and your RECs. And they are 1-year reductions. They reduce global emissions. I mean, this isn't air quality, right? I mean, we all know this. This is not your local non-attainment zone. This is global, global emissions. And they have very variable costs and characteristics. And the market is sophisticated. The general population and even a lot of the experts' knowledge of that market is not. The general perception of that market is pretty basic. Once you get into the actual carbon offset and RECs into that space, it's fairly sophisticated. So just want to give a quick snapshot of both the regulatory and voluntary pricing, just so you can see. I mean, this is effectively, commodity trading, right? So you have here on the in European, the carbon credits there. These are both the regulatory examples. And I'm not sure whether these are in euros or converted dollars. I tried to figure it out. I couldn't quite make sense of it. But I know that at the beginning of 2020, they were around 30 euros per ton. They went up to 60 euros by the end of the year, and they've just gone all over the place. And I mean, you can see. I think this is about Ukraine. And the big thing that they you talk about is that if there is just a need for energy, all of a sudden some of these things may be less important, right? They're going to say, hey, we need gas. It becomes less important, and that was sort of reflected. That's my non-insider knowledge assumption of what happened here. I think it could very well be something else, but there was this brief dip. If you want to buy the dip on carbon offsets, there was an opportunity we all missed. So. And then on California, it's sort of, you can see these are dollars, but the average is right around $27, and that's what it's less expensive than some voluntary and more expensive than others. But that's what the regulatory market has looked like. Generally, the trend is it's at least in Europe is up. Even here, I mean, this is probably. We can talk to other people that can prognosticate on where they think the market's heading. I think in general it's heading up, but that's just me. Not give financial advice, full disclosures right here. None of this counts as so please don't consider it as such. If European, we're still here. Wait a minute. Oh, this was just looking a little further back to give more of a time trend. Here's where carbon prices were in Europe in 2019, and then boom, they just blew up, and that's sort of the long term. Here's California, again, very up and down as the market's sort of figuring itself out. Had to have sort of a period of relative calm, and now we're sort of in this space where things are starting to figure themselves out again. But this is just a longer. On the voluntary side. Just a couple quick examples. We have the aviation carbon offset. They're different industries. I'm not going to get into anything about the aviation industry, but I will talk a little bit about nature-based carbon offsets. This is sort of some voluntary spot pricing at a certain amount of volume. I don't know what it is other than this has some portfolio, not quite like an EFT, but they're looking at these global emission offset futures. And $6 a ton here and $11 a ton for these sort of average of a nature-based carbon offset. That's, to me, that number is still sort of you're buying in bulk, and there's some very specific characteristics which we'll talk about what that looks like. But that's it's an industry average. This is just a snapshot. This is where carbon prices are going. And then I want to make the point, because you'll hear these terms a lot, of carbon offsets versus RECs, right? So carbon offsets are done on that metric ton equivalency, and they're, it's which is obviously right now they tend to use the AR4 same factors that the EPA uses for global warming potentials, right? So 25 for methane and 298 for N2O, even though that's fairly outdated with AR6 numbers out. It is tied to the implicit cost of carbon for a particular project. So how much does it cost for that project for each ton in general reduced? And that's in general the theory behind this, and that's probably not exact, but it's close enough. When you think about how many dollars does it take to reduce certain metric tons of carbon used to offset scope 1, direct emissions, and scope 3 that you choose to Ankur's point, your indirect GHG emissions. So that's generally what you use carbon offsets for. And then renewable energy certificates are specifically for your scope 2s, which are your electricity, purchase steam, purchase heat, but their units are different. A REC is 1 megawatt hour. Right, it is 1 megawatt hour of clean energy. It's wind, solar. Just think of it as wind or solar. That you can throw biomass and whatnot in there, but at the end of the day, it is a megawatt hour of renewable energy. You use that. The engineer in me doesn't like the fact that if you know that your power provider, the way that we calculate scope 2 emissions is we look at how much electricity you consumed in a given year, and then we look at the carbon content of that electricity by your utility provider. Ideally, your actual utility provider, but if not, then we look at the EPA subgrid factors, and we say, okay, well, if it's 55% coal and 27% natural gas, there is so much solar and wind, then we multiply it by that to determine what your actual CO2 emissions are. That is not the way that you offset it, though, typically in the marketplace. And what you typically do is you just do a 1-to-1. So even whether you're getting your electricity from, I'm from Colorado, we have Excel Energy, and they're going pretty far at decarbonizing. It doesn't matter whether I'm getting my energy from them or whether I'm getting it from somewhere, in the I don't know, the Northeast or Midwest that is more fossil fuel intensive. It does not matter. If I'm getting a REC, I just look at how much energy I consume, and then I offset it by buying a number of RECs that matches that. And so there's some reasons behind that, but what I don't like is that ultimately the emissions don't match up. Right? It's not a 1-to-1 emissions thing. But in general, when we hear about scope 2 GHG emissions, the way that they're traditionally offset is with RECs. You actually, in the United States anyway, you can't generate a carbon offset through a wind project or a solar project because they're no longer considered additional. They're sort of standard practice, and so there are still carbon offsets from solar and wind projects in other countries where they're not standard operating, which is probably too much, honestly. Like it gets really complex. And that's why a lot of people and a lot of our clients, we say, go talk to an emissions offset provider. Go talk to somebody who knows these markets. Once you get the basic understanding of it, then you can figure out what you want in an offset. And so what you want in the offset.
So just real quick.
Yeah, shoot.
Word out there in the ESG.
Right.
Is it a carbon offset or a REC?
It is a carbon offset for scope 1 and 3 and a REC for scope 2. Yep. So that's the sort of preferred path. So carbon offsets, they come in basically two top line flavors, right? There's removal or avoidance. Avoidance, the majority of your carbon credits out there are going to be avoidance. You're going to say that, instead of these emissions being released, we planted trees and it's avoiding, if it was managed like a logging operation, it would be this many emissions, but because we're preserving it, it's gonna avoid those many emissions. On the other hand, removal is sort of it's carbon sequestration, right? There is some means of actively pulling carbon from the atmosphere. They, typically cost, the cost of a removal credit for a carbon sequestration project, you can imagine, is probably $300 to $400 a ton, right? So that's an expensive proposition. The technology is not nearly competitive with these sort of avoidance, but you're also actually actively removing it, not just avoiding it, which is what the majority of emissions carbon offsets do. There's also, you can get a number of additional, and I think Ankur referenced this, you can get a number of additional environmental attributes depending on which carbon offset you go with. If you go with, say, we'll use that forest management one again, in addition to avoiding carbon, it also is going to create increased biodiversity. You're going to have maybe better water retention. It may have a number of other attributes that go along with it besides just the carbon benefits. And if that's what you're looking for, if that's what your stakeholders are looking for, you want to direct you, and that actually it's making the same point as sort of high quality versus low quality. Although there's maybe some public perception around which one is sort of high or low. But if you want to get one that it goes after a particular thing or tell a particular story, like a lot of the oil and gas companies that we work with will say, hey, we'd love to support, like a Ducks Unlimited, carbon offset project because you're preserving a bunch of land. It's in line with a lot of values of whether it's employees or shareholders. You're getting multiple benefits while removing the carbon. There's also, you're going to see each carbon offset has a vintage. So that is when it actually happened. So it's 2017, 2021, there's some 2010. You can still find these older ones on the market. They become progressively less valuable the older they get. In theory, you want to offset your emissions with emissions avoided in the same year or within, I think, 3 to 5 years. Is somewhere? Right. So there's some room there. And then registry, which Ankur touched on. There's 4 major registries. You want to make sure it's on one of those. I think I even break them out. And then location, right? You can find international credits. You can find American, US-based credits. It all sort of, as you're putting together, once you get into this, you end up putting together a carbon offset portfolio. And there's some companies that will bundle a bunch together and just sell you basically like a mutual fund, right? And they'll say, our carbon offset fund that you're investing in has some exposure to international. It has a dam project in Turkey, which keeps some of the prices low, but it also has some nature-based credits that are more expensive that are good and supporting this, and they'll give you this sort of, just like you look at a mutual fund, you sort of look at what the different top holdings are and what you want in there. So there's a lot more to it than, yeah.
Yeah, Connor, thanks. Maybe going back to the vintage years ago,
Yeah.
offsets to have all these different years associated
Yes.
with that.
Right.
I was attending one of your ESG talks this morning. How have you seen companies reporting voluntarily their offsets? Do they focus on the vintage year, the actual year that they're retired, the compliance year that they may be trying to associate that offset with?
Right.
Where have you seen?
It's the latter. It's compliance year. I mean, and I think it takes a fairly sophisticated, a lot of times they may not even disclose much more than we bought this whole bundle of credits, we retired them. The key point is you actually don't just hold them, they are actually retired, which means that they're gone. They have been taken out of the market, and you do it for a particular compliance year. You say for our 2021 emissions were this much, we retired these many credits, and depending on clientele, they'll either stop there or they'll say, and they were also had these other environmental attributes with them, right? And they supported projects mostly in the US, and they were a lot of nature-based offsets, or they, landfill gas projects, whatever the case may be. I'm going to show you an example actually of what we're doing at Spirit, what we're investigating right now for, we're much smaller than any of our clients, but just so you see that look. But I did want to make the point too, from a science-based perspective, a ton is a ton is a ton, right? So where there's some people who get really into whether it's nature-based or whether it's whatever it is, if you're avoiding it, it's slightly different avoiding versus removal. But in theory, if the calculations are done right and everything's equal, a ton is a ton is a ton. So it's, yeah.
Yeah, just to follow on Mark's question.
Right.
You mentioned retiring.
Yes.
So if it's done voluntarily, how do you officially retire?
It's tied back through the registry, right? Or through there's a whole chain of custody associated with one of these. And actually, I should have had some slides that walk through that for some, but where you can see, when it was generated, how it was generated, every list of transactions, kind of like blockchain, right? It's the same concept where you just sort of follow it all the way through until you make the decision and you say, hey, registry, we are retiring this many. We did this, our 2020 emissions, retire this many for us. Some companies will retire them annually on your behalf, and they'll just say, okay, you purchase these from us, and you don't even have to worry about retiring because we're just automatically retiring it at the end of the year. And then it's kind of up to you as reporting to say, say you retired 500 and you only used 400. You can kind of say, well, and here's 100. We got 100 in the bank for next year. And because it's not as regulated yet, it's not. So they'll just retire the whole 500 on your behalf, so you don't have to worry about it. And you say, okay, we've retired more than we used, but maybe we'll count them towards next year. It's kind of you kind of do what you want from that perspective. Does that answer your question?
Well, yes. So the registry makes them official.
The registry, I believe that. So I know they are listed as retired on the registry. I believe they are. That's where it's going to be listed. You may have to get with a project developer. I know they have the capability to do it. I know for us, we just say, hey, can you just confirm that these have been retired and show us the link that we can go through and check that chain of custody. So they do have to follow certain protocols in order to be registered. And so if there is not a protocol for it, it's not going to be able to be a verified carbon offset. So there are some forest management protocols, right? There is I heard this morning about a P&A, plug and abandonment protocol that is in the works through Vera, but that's not official yet. And so until the protocol is established and it's been vetted through their consensus process and everything else, you can't actually have that be a certified carbon offset. You can still say we reduced our emissions by this much because it is a voluntary market, but the more there's increased scrutiny on that, you're not going to be able to say that if it's not verified, if it's not on one of the 4 major registries, it's not going to be as valuable, and it's not going to be the kind of thing that you can there's not really a mechanism to trade that back and forth. But at the same time, if you can just generate those carbon reductions yourself, you don't have to go through the whole verification process. I believe it may be a 18 to 21 month process from initiating to getting it fully verified. You can just say we did it. We're still, and if you can make that scientifically defensible, then we've seen companies do that, and it's a lot easier. And then there are these 4 major registries, ACR, Climate Action Reserve, Gold Standard. I'm just going to mention that almost all of the gold standard offsets do have additional environmental attributes. So that's one of the things that they're known for, is having more water protection or habitat or whatnot. So I think that the same may be true of particular offsets on the rest of them. But I know old sort of hangs there. So I think the last 3 slides I have. So we got a link from a company. I'm sure that they're listed on here or not. Sent to us from a carbon offset provider, a project developer that sells these. Using this nifty little software system, which I hadn't seen until then, we were able to see it sent us just the projects by this particular project developer. We got a little price tag on here, and how much per ton. This is that cost of carbon from a offset perspective. Everything from this one. This is South Dakota, so it must have been grandfathered in. This you can tell is a little bit older, before you weren't allowed to generate carbon offsets from renewable projects in the U.S. And so then when you dive down and we're trying to figure out, well, what do we want to do? For each of them, they have this sort of, some pretty pictures, a little bit more. It's avoidance, not removal. Here's the standard. Here's the developer. So we got this from Element Markets. And then what's in the inventory? How many are available? Right, and here's the vintage year of 2019. And then they even have this which we think being in the sustainability space, but all the different other benefits from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that this supports. So this lists some of the other environmental attributes. So it really gives you a good ability to sort of compare on a pretty deep level what these carbon offsets are, so you can make your choice, right? And you still got to get down to this 8 per ton. So this is a fairly on the higher end of pricing. You can also, if you're going to get volume, this I should say that the retail portal. If you are a company that is work directly with one of these brokers and you're doing a large quantity, these numbers can come down significantly as you're looking for a quantity, economies of scale kind of thing. So this is what we looked at. And then this is I haven't told our CEO this, who's sitting in the back corner. But this is our current selection, which we haven't actually pulled the trend. But the reason that it's a methane landfill gas capture project in Utah. And so why did we select this are we looking at selecting this? Well, it's got a pretty decent price tag at $11.15 a ton. Some people sort of knock landfill gas collection, but as environmental scientists, we respect the fact that that's a ton is a ton is a ton is a ton, right? I mean, that landfill gas would be leaking into the atmosphere if they didn't have this gas collection. They actually, do I have another? But they actually use it to generate energy. They flare some of it, but it's better than having it leak out of the landfill. And we like this just because as environmental scientists, we understand that keeps methane emissions out of the atmosphere. And so this is the sort of leading contender for us right now. So that's the process that you go through to making these selections. I mean, we're a small, we're 200 tons of carbon a year, so which is really on the business side, another maybe 200 in commuting. So we're tiddlywinks compared to every single one of our customers, but and clients, but that's our thought process. I think.
So for that specific example, are they burning the methane?
They are either using it to create energy, or my understanding, this goes down, when you read more, there's some more, or in cases where it's already at capacity and there's more gas, then they are burning it, which is way better than venting it, but still burning it. But it's in any case, they have it measured to know exactly. And so what we're paying for with our offsets is the back end costs of installing that project on the front end. So they paid for it on the front end, and part of their pro forma was selling these carbon offsets that would help pay for the project down the road, and we're helping do that.
So that 9,000 tons.
Right.
They're pulling out methane, so they count that, but they're burning it, there's CO2 going out.
Right.
So that is not part of that.
It's compared to, so it's avoidance. It's compared to if they just vented it. So if they vented it, there would be way more than if they burn, right?
They don't take, or they don't subtract out the carbon that they're.
They do subtract it out.
It's the carbon potential of methane.
Right.
Yeah, it's the potential of methane is greater than carbon.
Right. If a metric ton of methane is is 25 CO2 equivalents, right? Because it has greater potential to warm the atmosphere over a shorter period of time. And so each metric ton that you'd rather have a metric ton of carbon, because that's 1/25th as a greenhouse gas as a metric ton of methane. So it's sort of, rather than having the methane vent directly, the combustion and the CO2 from the combustion, all day, I would rather they had it all for converting into energy, and run turbines and actually, power homes with it and whatnot. But I also understand from a practical perspective that if you got that much gas running through and you're at capacity and you have other gas coming through, it's got to go somewhere, right? I mean, so if, running it to in the oil field, yeah, you run that to a flare or something, but here it's sort of the same thing.
Generally, all the registries can count for that. They issue cuts. So it's a net, the net is what is registered as the volume.
Right. And so then they have approximately 2,200 of these tons available for. So if you guys are looking to purchase some, there you go. There's some options for you. Just don't take our 200. Recs are a little bit different. Just quickly, I'm going to blaze through this. Is that Recs you can get after you calculate your energy consumption, and this is becoming more important in light of the SEC ruling that you do have to track your scope 2 emissions as well. But you can check with your local utilities. The best way to do this, in my opinion, is that a lot of times you can get, and especially, in Texas, an unregulated market here, I've known companies will just throw in the recs, right? And say, hey, you want recs, we'll give them to you. Nobody else is asking for them. Or there's some limited amount, and they'll, just to get your business, they will say, okay, we're not going to increase your rates. And this happened once, but it could be, I don't have a lot of experience negotiating utility contracts in Texas, but you can get, if they're getting, Texas has 40% wind anyway. And so if there's a particular company and it's not who's doing that, you can get that on your bill and you're done, right? If you just say, hey, we just want to offset our recs, tell us how much it would cost us. Generally, you're most cost effective, and the fact that it'll be supporting projects that are on the grid in your state, in your location, are working with your local utility. It's a little bit more legwork, and especially if you have operations all over the country, then you have to go to sort of all these different ones. You can also buy them on the, really, even the searching the web for global recs, the rec world is not as cut and dry as the carbon offset market from a easy to find, because so many go through green energy programs with your local utility. It's not just as developed. I was Googling, recs for buy recs, national green recs for like 15 minutes without getting a solid hit. It was not, it's just not as easy to find. And so we recommend going with your local utilities, but if you look more than 15 minutes, you will find some rec purchasing. And there are some retail sites through some of the carbon offset brokers where you can just get them straight from them that are what they call Green E certified, is the sort of gold standard of a rec. Just like you have the different registries on the carbon offset side of things. And then you do want to make sure that they're going to be retired and document them. I think there you go. God, it's washed out. I'm not that orange in real life, but yeah, that's all I got. So let's take some questions. I know that's a lot of